and I was in a full-blown adulterous relationship with this woman for 4 years, but my wife never knew anything about it. Her husband never knew anything about it. Nobody else knew anything about it. I've never encountered anybody after God worked in our lives to say, well, we were wondering about that. I can't make this up. The things that have happened in God's grace and mercy and patience is almost unbelievable. My name is Gary Denton. I'm a 77-year-old retired pharmacist in Russellville, Arkansas. And I came to know the Lord when I was young, about 15 years old. Didn't live like I should have, but God's been good and supplied some protection over the last many years. Married, and my wife passed away in October of 2023 after 55 years.
I'm sorry to hear that. As you followed Jesus, what was an area of your life where you felt he was calling you into greater intimacy, obedience, or lordship over your life?
Well, I've been rejected God's call almost all my life. I would have a disobedient child of the Lord for about 26 years, quite truthfully. In fact, it was very private. God's protected me, and you'll hear later on how much he protected me. The last 35 years have been fine. The first were not.
And when did you first realize that Jesus was asking you to make a change in your life, or to submit yourself, your life to him and his calling?
Well, I was actually called by the Lord, like I said, early in my life, but I just had rejected every time he called until in 1989, when I was at the end of an adulterous relationship. Well, I almost have to give you a little background of that, how bad it was. But I had done everything I could do to get out of it, including helping the woman I was involved with get moved out of town. And when I prayed to God one morning, serving the Lord's Supper as a deacon in our church, he answered that night. And I'd like to go in detail on that answer sometimes. I had to have a little bit of background leading up to it, how bad it was. Well, I got married in 1968. My wife had been married before. She got married when she was 16 years old, come out of a bad home situation. Met her right after her divorce in 67. We got married in love and lust. I'll have to be honest about that. But the marriage was not bad, kind of bumpy. She retained some. I never knew anything about the previous marriage, never asked her about it. That's my daughter-in-law recently told me that was strange, but it didn't. I figured that was another part of her life, but it affected our life. Well, 60s, we were moving into, we graduated from college together. She was just trying to get an education to restart her life, and we went to college. Went together. We graduated together in the early 70s, 1970, and the next 10 years were interesting. I owned a business, got involved with a woman in my business before we started working in the morning, which meant it couldn't go fully into a full-blown adulterous relationship. A lady that worked the store had a car wreck, and she had to bring the lady to work, and gave us a chance to take our breath, and we said, this ain't right, and we quit. God broke it off, but he used that accident to do that. And then she went on her own way, and that was never revealed to anybody. My wife never knew about it. Nobody else did either. God protected us. It gets even deeper here in a few minutes. I was a Sunday school teacher, a deacon in church, and got involved with another deacon's wife. And I can make no excuse for that. Both relationships I were in started in just talking to somebody. I would warn everybody to be careful about it. Conversations that can turn into more depth than you mean them to. But anyway, and I was in a full-blown adulterous relationship with this woman for 4 years before God finally stepped in, but my wife never knew anything about it. Her husband never knew anything about it. Nobody else knew anything about it. I've never encountered anybody after God worked in our lives to say, well, we were wondering about that. You can't, I can't make this up. The things that have happened in God's grace and mercy and patience is almost unbelievable.
You're in this adulterous relationship. At what point did you hear Jesus inviting you to lay that down and walk in obedience in your marriage with him?
I hate to say this. He told me the first night,
Mm.
and I was convinced the first night this was wrong, and I went ahead and did what my will wanted to do, my flesh wanted to do. And off and on through that relationship, the full 4 years of it, there's times I would say, this is just not right. But I was tangled up in the flesh and actually my household with my wife wasn't bad to start either. That was amazing. But finally in 1989, I was serving the Lord's Supper in the morning. I'd done everything I could to get that woman out of my life and out of my town, even helped her to move out of town while she was getting a divorce, which is another terrible thing. And I prayed, Lord, I don't want to ever take this dirty again. That night I came home from a deacon's meeting. My wife was on the phone with a woman I had involved with, and she was telling my wife she should be a better wife. And she got off the phone and looked at me and said, you haven't been involved with her, have you? She had no idea. And I said, yes, I have. Now, the next week to 10 days, it's hard to describe. So intense, it's beyond belief. That was 22nd of January, 1989. My wife took off her rings. She screamed, she cried, she tore up things in the house. She went to her mother's house, which is in the same town. And over the next 3 months, the only person that knew what was going on besides my wife and I was my mother-in-law, who didn't take sides. Anyway, during that 3-week period, I am fully convinced. I cried. I begged her. I didn't want to lose her. I am fully convinced God talked to her, and she wasn't saved. And she was saved. God forgave her. She forgave me. You know, Valentine's Day of 1989, February the 14th, she put her rings back on, and we began a 2.5-month journey of cleaning up our lives.
I'd like to hear a little bit about what was going on in your wife's heart during that week-long period following the moment where she learned about the relationship.
Well, what she said afterwards was, I've never made Jesus the Lord of my life. That she said that God, and she never talked to anybody else. She never talked to anybody but her mother. And her mother didn't take sides, by the way. I've already said that. But what she was a knowledgeable person about the Lord. She'd been in the church all along. She'd actually been baptized twice before we got saved, before we got married. So she knew, she just didn't know the Lord as her Savior. And that's what she said. Jesus Christ became the Lord of my life, and he told me to forgive you. And she didn't get that counsel from anybody else. She did. And when she did, she forgave me. And I'll say this at the end, but we had 35 great years after that. And after I came before the church and asked the church's forgiveness, she never mentioned it again. And most people find that hard to believe, but I just have to say, it was amazing work of God. I mean, literally. Now, back to when Life Action came to our church, they brought a crusade that was the last 2.5 weeks, ended up lasting, or 2 weeks, and it lasted 3 weeks, 3.5. At that point, I was counseled to come before the church and seek forgiveness. Now, I had offended God. I had sinned against God, but I needed to seek forgiveness of the church. So, and I was counseled before I came before to go to the man I am involved with his wife. So I came forward. I was counseled, you need to go to him first. So I went that Sunday afternoon, and he broke his heart, just like I broke my wife's heart. He was a personal friend. We played racquetball together. You know, we were close personal friends. He was another deacon in the church. Anyway, so that night I came forward. Church called me up, and I confessed it. And then the guy that was leading our crusade, named Tim St. Clair, told the group, said, now, as a church you forgive him, you come personally forward as couples and forgive him. We stood there for maybe close to an hour. While they went ahead with the thing, we stood on the side of the church, and they came forward and forgave me. So I'd like to go back and say one thing, that when he told me to seek this man to come before me, I went out of the church on Sunday morning, looked up into the balcony where I thought he was, and he was sitting there, 2 rows behind him was sitting with a man he'd been involved with 10 years before with his wife. He didn't know anything about it. He didn't even go to our church. He just come to find out what was going on to our church. So, and God told me, go to him later. I don't hear voices, but that's what it said. So that our whole life changed in that. Well, it changed that when my wife forgave me, and God told her to, and she said, I never made Jesus Christ the Lord of my life. And when she did, she changed so much that people, before I came to the church and confessed what I was doing, people kept asking, what's happened to the Denton's house? And mostly what they said, I had a lady tell me a few weeks ago, said she just looked different. She was. She was a saved woman. And she was a nice looking woman. But she became beautiful. In fact, I had another lady in our church who wasn't a really complimentary lady, said, your wife is just beautiful. And she was, inside and out. There's also so many little nuances after this. I'd like to share a few of them when you may have a question. It changed my life completely. I became the man I should have been.
Yeah. When you saw the transformation that took place in your wife's heart during that a couple week period after you confessed, what took place in your heart as you saw that transformation take place in hers?
Well, for me, it was honestly relief. I didn't lose my wife. I didn't lose my family. I have 3 sons. 2 of them still live with me because of the developmental issues. And it was just a confirmation that God is real. He will work. If even an adulterous relationship doesn't have to break up a marriage, if you get 2 willing people and God, you don't need anybody else. We didn't have anybody else. And God literally answered my prayer. I don't want to take this dirty again. He said, you're dirty enough, but I'll clean you up. And all those situations we'd had in the past, and I told my wife, basically, when she forgave me and forgot, that's like God putting from the east to the west. It was just, it wasn't me. It wasn't, but it changed my heart, and I did everything I could and did for the rest of our life. We had, it created a marriage that we hadn't had. In fact, even fleshly and sensely, the marriage I've been looking for already was in my household, because God just changed our marriage completely. And it was God. It wasn't either one of us. She didn't know the Lord, and I didn't listen to him. What
challenges or struggles did you run into as you walked through this experience and as he guided you through this process?
Well, it wasn't a struggle when you trust God, because, I thought my life was over when I came before the church. It just began. You got to trust God that he will clean up things. Amongst other things, I'd resigned as a deacon, and for 7 years I was resigning. And I went out one day teaching Sunday school. I forgot something. I went out into the parking lot, and the father of the man I was involved with, who was an older deacon in our church, was walking across the parking lot. And I walked up to him. I said, hey, it's the 3rd time they voted me in as a deacon. I had to say I wouldn't accept it. And I said, if you don't want me to, I won't go back. He said, Gary, God forgave you, the church forgave you, and I forgave you. You do what God wants you to. It's been a miraculous work. And I went back on, and 3 years later, they elected me chairman of deacons. It's a good church. When I mentioned the Life Action coming to our church, they didn't bring revival. They brought principles. Our church bought into them. And I bought into them. God's just changed my heart. I have a difficult time with my wife passing away, but I'm totally at peace that she knows where she is. Anyway, and she anyway, don't want to tear up on you.
That's okay.
But, let me share one other little thing.
Yeah.
A year after I had met with the man I was involved with, his wife, he called me and said, we need to visit. So, yeah, okay. So we did, and we visited and talked 3 or 4 times. And I don't think it was an ulterior motive, but in the course of talking about that one time, he said, I'm going to move out of town, and I have a chance to do something. I need to get a little money. Could you loan me $1,000? I said, let me ask my wife. She said, well, that's fine. We're fairly well off, And so I loaned him $1,000. Hadn't seen him again until just recently. Anyway, but that was, I just felt like that God was working that. And I will tell you, in the interim of those last 35 years, we've done a lot of things. We've been to Brazil a couple of times, spent our 25th wedding anniversary in Brazil on a boat. God's just good. Went to Africa a couple of times, to Kenya, took one of our disabled sons with. It's been an interesting journey over the last 35 years, including about 2 years ago, we had an old revivalist come to our church, been with us many, many times, and I told my wife, let's give him $1,000. So we did. 2 weeks later, the man I'd been involved with, his wife, 35 years old, that I hadn't seen in 34 years, was standing in my parking lot and said, God told me to come give you this $1,000 back. I gave $1,000 away. Well, 2 weeks later, God gave it back to me. You can't make that up. That's God working, just confirming that what he's done in our lives is real. And like I said before, the one thing I would say to men and women in their mid-30s, be cautious about just starting conversations. And the other thing is I would say to men and women that are in the adulterous relationship, men or women, God can save it. He can clean it up if you trust him. God has been really, really good to us.
What happened can you share a little bit about what happened as you walked in obedience to his invitation to walk in obedience and to lay this down at his feet? What did you find out about yourself, and what did God reveal about himself through this process?
Well, first thing I would reveal that God's really big and I'm really small, and that I've been teaching Sunday school since the early 80s, obviously not clear with a clear heart. I've been teaching Sunday school since the clear 80s until my wife was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer last summer. And the more I learn, the more I know I don't know. It's just God is so big and so his depth. He's the only one you can trust. I can't trust myself. I'm a weak man. I can't trust myself, but I can trust God. But you have to be in the Word. You have to be listening. You have to know what God's saying, and then you have to obey it. And I've tried to do that the best I can. I'm just a weak man. I know that. But the 55 years that we had as a marriage, the first 20 was a teaching experience. The last 20 have been a really teaching experience. I learned to walk day by day. I try to stay in the Word every day. I try to hear and listen and obey. Now I have 2 disabled sons living with me, and I'd rather go home and be with my wife, go to heaven. That's not God's call for my life right now. I don't think I'm suffering like people in our world are suffering a lot worse than I am. I mean, I'm a financially successful person. That doesn't mean that you're not going to take any of that with you. But I don't depend on the wealth or anything like that. I depend on God. And it takes a day-to-day dependence. You need to be in the Word. You need to be in the prayer. You need to be knowing God every day. And it teaches me how weak I am, but how strong God is. What God did in our lives to change our lives, to save our life, you can't purchase it.
Did saying yes to this journey cost you anything?
Unfortunately not. It cost me getting rid of my sin, And, there's some friends that, I lost a few friends, but not in our church friends. The friends from the past, I probably needed to lose them. I did need to lose them. And I also, one thing I say it did cost me, I was kind of upward mobile, looking to be somebody. And when God changed my life, I didn't want to be somebody anymore. I was on 2 or 3 boards. My profession, I was trying to move forward and things like that. God told me to lay all aside. You just be an obedient child and just obey me. And it's a whole lot better. I walk both sides of the fence. It's a whole lot better on this side of the fence. If you know what I mean.
You've shared a couple of things that you've learned through this process with regards to things specific for older or men and women. What else have you learned through this process that you might want to share with other people who are going through something similar or are just going through a hard time?
Well, all of us go through hard times. A simple thing is, a very simple thing is, all of us are going to die. You need to make long range plans because there is a future out there. For individual couples, I would say, speaking to couples, but individual type, I was saved and early on, and I didn't listen. Now, when you're 77 years old, it's not time to quit listening. If you're still here, God has a reason for you still being here. But I would say to couples, depending on what the situation we came out of, you need to stay in your own pasture. That's not really funny, but you need to do that. Because if you are married, the decision is this is the right person for you was forever settled when you said, I do. In fact, my dad was an interesting guy. But when I got ready to walk out the door to go get married tonight, he said, son, if you want to change your mind, you do it right now. Well, that's what I say. Don't be cautious of the situations you get into. Don't let flesh lead you into it. And if it happens to do, make the best you can out of it, because God can work in anything. I'm not much of one to be giving advice. I'm not one to be on the saving the marriage circuit or anything like that. Except I can say God will work if two people are willing to let him do it. My wife was willing, and I was willing, and he did. And like I said, it never was a problem again. It's as hard as it may believe, because most women, I would think that couldn't have happened in 3 weeks. Well, it couldn't, unless God was there. Take long for God to take care of it. I may not have answered your question. If you have any other thoughts about me, I'm just a simple man that was disobedient to God, and God jerked. My old Arkansas saying he jerked a knot in my tail and got me out of it.
How was your life different after answering that call and invitation to walk in obedience to King Jesus in this area of your life?
Well, I thought that when I came before the church, my life was over. It just started. I have more friends. I have more people that trust me. I'm a member of a good church with a bunch of good people, and losing my wife was the hardest thing I've ever had, and the people really come around me. So it changed my life at that point, but it changed my life. Like I said, we took mission trips. Like I said, to Brazil, we've been to Kenya, we've been all over the world, we've been to Israel. God just gave us a life and it's totally changed our lives. We were trying to be somebody. When we got trying to be somebody, then God gave us life.
Gary, last question as we wrap up. Who is Jesus to you?
Jesus is my only hope. I'm a sinner. There's only one hope of salvation God provided. It's Jesus Christ. There's no other answer. There's no other answer except Jesus Christ. And I can tell you, he's real. I mean, I haven't heard any voices, maybe close, but I am a born-again believer because of Jesus Christ and what he did for me on the cross. There's no other way, and it's never too late. One of my favorite guys out of Scripture is the thief on the cross. He didn't ever do one thing right in his life until the last minute. So there's always hope. There's always hope.